She was hiding under the bed when he brought her in. Clara Whitfield, 38 years old, former attorney, the woman whose name was on the wedding invitation stacked downstairs in the Graywood Mill foyer, was pressed flat against cold hardwood in the dark, her mother's diamond earrings in her hand, controlling her breathing the way she once controlled depositions. One measured intake at a time. The sitting room door had clicked shut, the voices had begun, and Clara did not move. What James Harmon did not know, what neither he nor the woman laughing softly beside him on that bed could possibly have known, was that the woman lying motionless on the floor beneath them was the sole controlling trustee of a $180 million estate that included a 22% ownership stake in the very building where James's firm operated. He had been, without ever knowing it, paying rent to his fiancée's dead mother for 3 years. He called Clara usefully dependent. He said she no longer had the instincts for business. He said this 18 inches above her head in a room she effectively owned, while his mother was downstairs rearranging seating charts and his mistress was making herself comfortable on a bed Clara had paid for. Not one of them knew. This is not simply a story about a betrayal the night before a wedding. It is a story about what happens when powerful people mistake a woman's patience for ignorance, and what it costs them when she finally decides to stop being patient. If you believe that quiet people are sometimes holding the loudest truths, hit like and subscribe. This channel is built for you. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. We want to know. Now, to understand what Clara was really holding in that dark room, we need to go back to where this story truly began. To understand what Clara was really holding in that dark room, we need to go back to where this story truly began. 20 minutes before she slid beneath that bed, Clara Whitfield was sitting at the edge of the bridal suite mattress in her nightgown, unable to sleep, staring at the shape her wedding dress made hanging against the armoire door. The dress was ivory silk, floor length, chosen by a woman who had believed 6 months ago when she selected it that the marriage it was made for was real. The room around her was quiet in the particular way that expensive places are quiet, insulated, self-contained, sealed against the world outside. The Berkshire's October pressed cold against the windows. The estate grounds were dark. She had been lying down for 2 hours. Sleep had not come. She thought of the earrings, Margaret's diamond drops, left in the small sitting room that adjoined the suite, the room she had been using since arriving 2 days earlier, spreading her things across its vanity table the way she used to spread case files across her office desk, methodically, each object in its assigned place. She had taken the earrings off the previous afternoon and set them beside the mirror. She had meant to bring them through. She had forgotten. She needed them, not for the morning, for now, for the specific weight of them in her palm in the dark. She crossed the suite and put her hand on the sitting room door. Inside, voices. She did not fully understand what she was hearing in those first 2 seconds. The mind protects itself momentarily from what it already knows. She opened the door an inch. The room was dim, lit only by the lamp on the far nightstand. And James was there, and so was the woman Clara had spent 18 months convincing herself was not a concern. Renata Walsh, head of investor relations at Harmon Capital, James's colleague. James's explanation, whenever Clara had found herself noticing. Renata, who James described as intense and brilliant and professionally essential and nothing more, was sitting with her shoes off on the sitting room bed, and James was beside her, and there was nothing in the arrangement that required interpretation. Clara took 1 step backward. Her heel caught the doorframe. James did not look up. She had 2 seconds. She lowered herself to the floor and slid beneath the bed on the far wall. The hardwood was cold through the thin fabric of her nightgown. She pressed her palms flat against it and controlled her breathing the way she had once controlled depositions. 1 measured intake, 1 quiet release. Nothing the body does without permission. She did not make a sound. Above her, James was speaking. He was describing the wedding the way he described quarterly projections, in terms of what it would yield, what it would stabilize, what it would close. Clara was a structural decision, he said. Her family's name carried a certain credibility in rooms his first-generation standing still hadn't fully penetrated. She had become, over the course of their 4 years together, usefully dependent, which was a kind of security in itself. He said this without lowering his voice. He said it the way a man speaks when he has long since stopped considering the possibility that he might be overheard. Renata said something Clara didn't catch. Then she laughed. Then James said that Clara no longer had the instincts for business, that leaving her practice had softened something in her. He did not frame it as a loss. He framed it as convenient. He did not correct her. He agreed. Clara lay on the cold floor of a room she had paid for, beneath a bed in a venue she had contracted, and she felt something move through her chest that was not quite pain and not quite clarity, but was the specific sensation of a long-held illusion completing its collapse. She had known in the way a person can know something and refuse to name it, for longer than she could now honestly account for. The hotel receipt she hadn't asked about, the phone tilted away, the name that appeared in his messages once, briefly, before he shifted his grip. She had filed each of them under adjustment. She was done adjusting. The earrings were on the nightstand. She could see them from the floor. Her mother's diamond drops, catching the thin light from the window, exactly where she had left them the previous afternoon. She did not reach for them yet. She waited. She counted the sounds, the low exchange of voices, the shift of weight above her, the unhurried movements of people who believe themselves entirely alone. The door opened, closed. The hallway went quiet. She counted to 60. Then she rose. She put the earrings on in the dark, using her reflection in the black window glass. Her hands did not shake. She looked at herself for a long moment. Her full face, her soft shoulders. The woman in the glass who had spent 4 years making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's design. And she looked without flinching. She went to her room. She went to the drawer beside the bed. She opened it. The envelope was where she had placed it 2 years ago, after the funeral, when she had told herself she would never need what was inside it. The paper had gone slightly soft at the corners from time. The attorney's card was paper-clipped to the front. Denise Farrow, Farrow and Crane, Providence. Clara's hand rested on the envelope. She had held this card for 4 years. Through every adjustment, every revision, every quiet removal of something that had once been hers. She had held it the way her mother had taught her to hold the things that mattered most, without displaying them, without spending them, until the moment arrived that made their use not just possible, but necessary. That moment, it turned out, was now. To understand the envelope in that drawer, you have to understand the woman who prepared it. Margaret Whitfield did not look like a person who owned things. That was the point. She drove a 10-year-old Volvo and bought her coats at the same department store she had shopped at since Clara was small, and the house she raised Clara in, a wide, gray-shingled property on Narragansett Avenue in Providence, was comfortable and unassuming and gave nothing away. The neighbors knew Margaret as the quiet widow who kept a tidy garden and made excellent pie and never talked about work. What they did not know, because Margaret had constructed it precisely this way, was that she had spent 30 years building and selling commercial real estate under a rotating series of holding companies with names like Bridgepoint Acquisitions LLC and Coastal Merit Properties Group. Names that appeared in no obituary, no social profile, no conversation Margaret Whitfield ever had at a neighborhood dinner. 32 properties, across 8 states, all of it structured so that the name on the door was never under any circumstances hers. Clara was 17 the summer she finally asked why. They were on the dock behind the house, a weathered wooden platform that extended over the edge of the property where the yard met a narrow inlet. Margaret was drinking coffee from her plain white cup, the one with the small chip on the handle that she refused to replace, watching the water the way she watched most things, with patience that looked like stillness and was actually attention. Clara had found a property filing that week, in a drawer she wasn't meant to be searching, and she had held the question for 3 days before she sat down beside her mother and asked it directly. Margaret listened. She set down her cup. Then she said what she always said when Clara asked a question she'd been waiting to answer. She said it simply, as though it were obvious, as though any other approach would have been a waste of both their time. The name on the door is never the whole story, Clara. Read the lease. Clara didn't fully understand it at 17. She understood it the way you understand something that will take 20 years to become true. The scene shifts now. The light changes. 2 years before the night at Greywood Mill, Margaret Whitfield was in a hospital bed at Miriam Hospital on Dorrance Street in Providence, and the cancer that had begun in her pancreas had finished the work it started 14 months earlier. She was 61 years old. She was smaller than Clara had ever seen her, but her eyes were the same. Patient, attentive, watching. Clara sat beside her and held her hand and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and Margaret had never had much use for words that existed only to fill silence. Near the end of that visit, Margaret reached beneath her pillow and produced an envelope. Heavy paper, cream-colored, sealed. She pressed it into Clara's hands with the specific deliberateness of a woman transferring something that matters. "Not yet," she said. "You'll know when." The envelope contained the Whitfield family blind trust documentation, 43 pages, drafted by Denise Farrow of Farrow and Crane in Providence, who had been Margaret's attorney for 22 years, and who Clara had met exactly 3 times as a child and once at the funeral. The trust held $180 million in assets across 7 commercial real estate holdings. Among them, listed on page 19, was a 22% ownership stake in 200 Federal Street in Boston, a Class A commercial building in the financial district whose primary tenant, occupying the 14th and 15th floors under a lease at $34 per square foot, was a private equity firm called Harmon Capital Partners. James Harmon had been paying rent to Margaret Whitfield's estate for 3 years at that point. He had never once wondered who owned the building. Why would he? Clara did not know any of this when she filed the envelope in the drawer of her bedside table after the funeral. She filed it the way you file something you cannot yet face, carefully, specifically, in a place you will be able to find it later. She told herself she would read it when she was ready. Then she met James, and being with James required a particular kind of readiness that seemed to leave very little room for anything else, and the envelope stayed where she put it. Here is what James was in those early months. He was quick and warm and genuinely curious, the kind of person who asked follow-up questions and remembered the answers, who would call on a Tuesday because something had reminded him of a conversation they'd had the week before. He was interested in Clara's work. He asked her to walk him through cases, and he listened, really listened, and pushed back intelligently. And Clara had not realized until she met him how much she had wanted someone to argue with her as an equal. Their first year felt like a conversation that didn't need to stop. She left her practice 14 months in when James suggested it. He framed it as space, room to breathe, time to decide what she actually wanted, a pause from the billing hours and the client management that had been grinding her down. He said it with such care that it felt like a gift. She did not notice at the time that the gift required her to stop being the person she was when he met her. She would notice later. She was not there yet. Clara put Denise Farrow's card in the drawer beside the envelope. She closed it. She told herself the life she was stepping into was the one she had chosen, and choosing was the same as being safe. She was wrong about that, but it would take 4 more years to understand exactly how. The erosion did not happen all at once. That is the important thing to understand. It happened the way water reshapes stone, not through any single moment of force, but through the patient, unremarkable repetition of small things, each one almost nothing, each one adding to the accumulation of the one before. It began in the 2nd year. James stopped asking Clara's opinion on decisions the way he used to, in that easy, genuine way that had made her feel like a partner in the life they were building together. The conversations that had once run late into the evening, about the firm's strategy, about cases she was following, about the particular texture of the world they were both trained to read closely, those conversations shortened, then thinned, then stopped arriving altogether. He was busy. The firm was growing. She told herself that this was what growth looked like from the inside, and that the distance she felt was a temporary condition of success rather than a permanent feature of the marriage. She adjusted. She had become, without fully noticing, a woman who adjusted. At firm events, the adjustments became more visible, though only to her. James would correct her in passing, a gentle redirect in the middle of a story she was telling, a quiet interjection that repositioned her point as slightly less informed than she'd presented it. He did not do this cruelly. He did it efficiently, the way he did everything. in the manner of a man who believed that accuracy was always more important than the feeling the correction produced. Clara would finish the story with one fewer sentence than she'd planned. No one at the table noticed. James moved on. She smiled and reached for her water glass and held the stem until her fingers steadied. Then Eleanor entered the picture more fully. Eleanor Harmon lived in a 4-story brownstone on Chestnut Street in Beacon Hill that had been in the Harmon family for 2 generations, and she wore that fact the way she wore everything. Quietly, without announcement, in the absolute certainty that people who needed to know would understand. She had accepted Clara at the beginning of the relationship with a measured, well-mannered warmth that Clara had taken for approval. It was not approval, it was assessment. And as the months passed and James's firm climbed and Clara's visibility as a professional diminished, Eleanor's warmth underwent a gradual and very precise recalibration. It arrived in her language, never in her tone, which remained impeccable throughout. At a dinner on Chestnut Street in the 3rd year, Eleanor looked across the table at Clara's untouched bread and said with the warmth of genuine concern, "You know, they say women in their late 30s really should be paying closer attention to nutrition, for all sorts of reasons." She let the sentence end there, soft and complete, and touched her pearl necklace once and turned to ask James about the second fund. James said nothing. He reached for his own bread. Clara's hands were in her lap beneath the table. She pressed them flat against her thighs. The irony, which Eleanor could not have known and would not have survived knowing, was this. While she was cataloging Clara's visible inadequacies at that dinner table, the Whitfield family blind trust held a 22% stake in the building Eleanor's son went to every morning to convince himself he was powerful. The woman being gently managed at the end of Eleanor's table was the silent co-owner of James Harmon's professional life. But the architecture of the secret was, as Margaret had designed it, invisible. And so Eleanor continued her assessment, and Clara continued her adjustments, and the audience sits now with the weight of what neither of them knows. Renata Walsh appeared at firm events beginning that same year. She was introduced as James's head of investor relations, and she moved through those rooms with the easy authority of someone who understood exactly what she was worth in the specific currency those rooms traded. Clara noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit. A slight wrongness in the composition that you can't immediately name. She noticed the way James's posture changed slightly when Renata entered a room. She noticed that James laughed differently in those conversations. Quicker, less considered, more like the laugh she remembered from their first year together. She filed what she noticed under the category she had developed for things she could not afford to examine directly. Adjustment pending. Then came the dinner at the Meridian Club in the 4th year. James had invited 3 of his senior partners and their wives for a private dinner to mark the second fund's close. Clara sat at the far end of the table from Eleanor, which felt, at the time, like good fortune. It was not. Eleanor addressed the table midway through the main course, in the gracious way she had of commanding rooms without appearing to want them. "Clara, remind me," she said with a small smile, "before all of this, you were practicing law?" The phrasing was delicate. Before all of this, as though the life Clara had built before James was a rough draft that the current arrangement had replaced. Commercial contracts, was it? A beat. It's interesting work, though I imagine the transition must have been quite a relief. It takes a particular kind of temperament to sustain that sort of thing long term. One of the partners' wives made a polite murmuring sound. James reached for his wine. He did not speak. Clara looked at him for a fraction of a second. The window where he could have said something, should have said something. The space where a partner would have placed a single quiet word in her defense. It closed. He swirled his glass. The conversation moved on. The drive home that night took 40 minutes. Clara kept both hands on the wheel and watched the highway and thought, for the first time with genuine clarity, about the card in the drawer on Denise Farrow's letterhead. She thought about it for a long time. Then she thought about how much she had given up to be in this marriage and how much more she would have to give up to leave it. And she decided that what she'd seen at dinner was an anomaly rather than a pattern, that the warmth was still there beneath the distance, that patience was not the same as losing. She believed that. She needed to believe it. And so she filed the thought beside the others and drove home and unlocked the door and went to bed in the dark. On the kitchen counter, James's phone lit briefly as she passed. A name on the screen, visible for 1 second before the screen went dark again. Renata. No message preview. Just the name, and then nothing. Clara did not stop walking. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 8 months before the wedding. It was from Harmon Capital's internal operations team. A single page on firm letterhead, addressed to Clara at the Marlborough Street townhouse, informing her that, as part of a routine administrative restructuring, her name had been removed as secondary signatory on the firm's joint operating account, effective the previous Friday. She was thanked for her patience during the transition. There was no phone call before it arrived. There was no conversation after. James mentioned it that evening, briefly, the way he mentioned things he had already decided. He was loosening his tie at the kitchen counter, and he said it without looking up, that it was simpler this way, that the account had never really required two signatories, that the operations team had flagged it as redundant during a compliance review. He said the word redundant with the ease of a man who had not considered the weight it carried. Clara asked one question. He gave her an answer that sounded like a reason and was actually a closing statement. She nodded. She turned back to what she was doing. She did not know, standing in that kitchen, that this was the first removal, that there would be others. 6 weeks later, she was at the checkout counter of a Whole Foods on Newbury Street when her card was declined. The cashier, a young man named Tyler, whose name tag was slightly crooked, ran it twice with the professional neutrality of someone who had done this before. Clara stood with her full hips pressed against the counter edge, her coat still on, the small queue behind her patient and then less patient, and she felt heat move up the back of her neck in a way she hadn't felt since her first year of law school, when she'd been asked a question she didn't know the answer to. She paid with a different card. She called the bank from the parking lot. The account, she was told, had been closed the previous week. She was listed as a secondary holder, not a primary. Primary account holders initiate closures. She had not been consulted. She called James. He picked up on the third ring and told her he'd meant to mention it, that he'd consolidated the accounts as part of the same operational review, that her name was on the primary household account, and that was more than sufficient, that he'd set up a transfer arrangement so she'd have access to whatever she needed. He said whatever she needed with the inflection of a man conferring an allowance. She thanked him. She sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes before she started the car. This is the architecture of a certain kind of control. It does not arrive as a declaration, it arrives as administration. And because each piece is framed as efficiency rather than intention, the person being managed finds herself uncertain whether she is responding to cruelty or to logistics. Clara was trained to read contracts. She had not been trained to read this. Then something shifted in the quality of James's evenings. He began working late in a pattern that was too consistent to be circumstantial. 3 evenings a week, occasionally 4, always with a reason that was plausible and unverifiable. A client dinner, a portfolio review that ran long. Clara stopped asking for specifics somewhere around the 5th week, not because she didn't want to know, but because the asking had begun to feel in the particular atmosphere James had created around her doubts, like evidence of the fragility Eleanor had been quietly advertising on her behalf. Clara did not want to be fragile. She chose to be patient instead. She did not yet understand that James had arranged things so that those 2 options were the only ones she could see. She found a hotel receipt in March, the Le Méridien on Stewart Street, a Tuesday she remembered because she'd made dinner that evening, for the 2nd time that week, and eaten most of it alone. She placed it on the kitchen counter and waited for James to come home. When he did, he looked at it for a moment and then explained, fluently and without hesitation, that he'd taken a client there for an early breakfast meeting, and it had been easier to pay and expense it than to sort out the billing in the moment. The explanation was seamless. It had the structural integrity of a prepared document. Clara's chest was tight the entire time he spoke, but his face was so steady and his voice so reasonable that she found herself, as she had found herself before, revising her own perception downward. She said she understood. She put the receipt in the recycling. She did not know Renata Walsh had also been at the Le Méridien on that Tuesday. She would not know until the floor of the sitting room at Greywood Mill. In April, Clara called a former colleague at Whitmore and Crane, the Providence firm where she'd spent 6 years before leaving her practice, to ask about a part-time advisory position she'd heard had opened. The conversation was warm for about 45 seconds. Then her colleague, a woman named Patricia Hess, who had always been direct, became careful. She said the position had actually been discussed. She said James's name had come up. She said that someone from his network had mentioned Clara might not quite be ready to return yet, given the transition. She said all of this gently, which made it worse. Clara said she understood. She thanked Patricia. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she hung up. That evening she asked James about it directly. He listened to her with his full attention. That quality of attention she had once loved, which she now understood was not always warmth, but sometimes simply the focus of a man deciding how to reframe something. He said he'd mentioned to a contact that she was still finding her footing, that he hadn't wanted her to feel pressured, that he was protecting her from taking on too much before she was ready. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He said he just wanted her to be okay. She believed him. She needed to believe him. And she was so thoroughly isolated by then. No income, no professional access, no financial independence. 4 years of adjustments layered into a life she had built around a man who had revised the terms of that life without her knowledge. That believing him was the only thing that didn't require her to dismantle everything. A week later, at a firm anniversary event at the Langham Hotel on Franklin Street, Eleanor arrived with a small group and moved through the room with her customary efficiency. Renata Walsh was already there, near the bar, in a way that looked unrehearsed but wasn't. Eleanor crossed the room toward her. The greeting was warm, brief but specific. The warmth of people who have spoken recently, not the warmth of colleagues in the same building. Clara watched it from across the room and registered it as something she could not yet name. She filed it beside the hotel receipt, beside the phone screen on the kitchen counter, beside all the other adjustments she was still telling herself were manageable. In September, she signed the venue contract for Graywood Mill Estate, the Berkshires, October 12th. 200 guests. She used her legal name on the signature line out of habit. Clara Whitfield, the name on the trust, the name on every document Margaret had ever prepared for her. It was the last document she would sign in James Harmon's direction. She did not know that yet. She dated it and slid it across the desk of the events coordinator and took her copy and folded it into her bag. Outside, the September air was beginning to carry the first edge of autumn. She walked to her car and sat in it for a moment without starting the engine, her hand resting on the steering wheel, her eyes on the middle distance. She was not ready for what was coming. She was not yet certain what was coming. But something in her body, some residual precision from the years she had spent reading agreements that were designed to obscure what they actually contained, was beginning, quietly, to pay a different kind of attention. Graywood Mill Estate had been built in 1887 as a working textile mill and renovated a century later into the kind of event venue that appeared in the back pages of architectural magazines. Exposed timber beams, original stone walls, candlelight that turned everything warm and golden and slightly untrue. The rehearsal dinner was held in the long gallery on the ground floor, a room that ran the full length of the building's eastern wall and held that evening 200 people who had traveled from Boston and Providence and New York and several places further, all of them arriving with gifts and goodwill and the general conviction that they were witnessing the beginning of something. They were not wrong about that. They were wrong about what the beginning was of. Clara had dressed carefully. She wore a deep blue wrap dress that fell to her knee, soft fabric that moved with her full figure in a way she had always liked. And she had put Margaret's earrings in before remembering that they were in the sitting room and she was already running late. She had told herself she would retrieve them after dinner. She had gone down to the gallery without them, her earlobes bare, a small absence that she noticed the way you notice something missing from a familiar room. The table arrangement had been Eleanor's work. Clara had known this the moment she saw it, not because anyone told her, but because James's table always reflected his mother's priorities when Eleanor had been involved in the planning. Clara was seated at the far end of the head table, beside James's college roommate and his wife, both of whom were kind but knew her only as James's fiancée, which was the version of her that fit neatly into this room. Renata Walsh was seated 3 places from James, close enough to hold a conversation, far enough to maintain the appearance of professional courtesy. The arrangement was very precise. Eleanor had always been precise. The first hour passed the way those evenings pass, in the warm ambient noise of many conversations, glasses being refilled, the specific laughter of people who are performing enjoyment at a slightly higher register than they actually feel. Clara smiled. She asked questions. She complimented the flowers. Her shoulders carried a tension she had been managing for months, the kind that lives just below the surface of composure and doesn't show unless you know where to look. Then Eleanor rose. She tapped her glass once, with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never needed to tap it twice, and the room quieted with the efficiency of people who understand social hierarchy without having it explained to them. She smiled at the table. She looked at James. Then she looked at Clara with an expression that most people in the room would have described as fond. "I want to say a few words," Eleanor began, "about what it means to welcome someone into a family like ours." She spoke warmly. She spoke of James's accomplishments, of the Harmon name, and what it had required of the people attached to it. Then she turned the full warmth of her attention to Clara. "And Clara," she said with a small pause that lasted exactly long enough, "has shown such remarkable patience with all of it. It takes a particular kind of woman to step back from her own ambitions and simply be present for the people who need her. Not everyone can do that." Another pause. "We're grateful she found a way to make it work. Given everything," she raised her glass. "To James and Clara?" 200 people raised their glasses. James raised his, and he was smiling. No one could have pointed to the specific cruelty in Eleanor's words. That was the craft of it. But Clara heard the structure beneath them, the framing of her presence in James's life as an accommodation rather than a choice, the suggestion that her leaving her career was necessity rather than love, the faint implication that she was a woman who had found a way to make herself useful. She heard all of it. She touched the bare place where her earrings should have been, and she kept her expression exactly as it needed to be. Then something shifted in the quality of the room. James leaned slightly toward Renata, barely perceptible, a few degrees of inclination, the kind of adjustment that means nothing in isolation. But Renata turned at the same moment, and the look that passed between them was brief and complete, and carried its own private language. Clara saw it, not from across the room, from 3 feet away, because she had spent 8 months teaching herself not to look directly at what she suspected, and tonight her eyes had stopped cooperating with that instruction. She knew, fully, finally, without the softening of doubt. The knowledge settled into her chest, not as heat, but as a very specific cold. She did not change her expression. She reached for her water glass. Later, after the main course, a woman touched her arm gently from behind and said her name, Dana Reeves. They had worked together at Whitmore and Crane for 3 years, overlapping on 2 commercial lease negotiations that Clara had led. Dana was warm and a little cautious, and clearly happy to see her. She asked how Clara had been, asked about the practice, and then, with the directness of someone who genuinely wants to know, asked why she had left. Clara heard herself answer. She said she had needed space, that James had thought it made sense to step back for a while, that she was still figuring out the next chapter. Dana listened. Something moved across her face. Not pity, but recognition. The expression of a person who is hearing someone recite a version of themselves that doesn't quite fit. "Well," she said carefully, "you were one of the best I worked with. That doesn't just go away." She meant it as encouragement. Clara received it as the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in 4 years. James gave his toast at 9 o'clock. He was charming. He thanked the guests for making the journey. He spoke about the wedding as a milestone and about their life together as a project he was proud of, and then he turned to Clara and thanked her. Thanked her specifically by name for her patience and her flexibility. He said the word flexibility the way you use a word when you believe it is a compliment. The room responded warmly. Clara smiled and held her water glass and did not look at Renata and did not look at Eleanor and looked only at James, at the ease on his face, at the complete absence of anything that looked like reckoning, patience, flexibility, useful dependencies, and structural decisions. She excused herself at 9:30, citing a headache. James nodded without standing. Eleanor touched her pearls. No one followed her out. She went upstairs. She lay on the bridal suite bed in the dark with her coat still on, staring at the ceiling. too tired to sleep and too awake to rest. After a while, she thought of the earrings, still on the vanity table in the sitting room next door. Margaret's earrings, the one object she had promised herself she would wear tomorrow. She got up. She crossed the suite. She put her hand on the sitting room door, and she opened it. She closed the sitting room door behind her and stood in the hallway for a moment, her back against the wall, her hands at her sides. The estate was completely quiet. The rehearsal dinner had ended an hour ago, and the floors below had gone still. There was no sound from anywhere. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not cry. The feeling that moved through her was too large and too complete for that. It occupied the whole of her chest and pressed outward against her ribs, and she breathed around it carefully. The way you breathe around something that has not finished settling. She was still wearing the earrings. She could feel their small weight at her jaw. She reached up and took them out and held them in her cupped hands and sat with them in the dark. A memory surfaced. The dock in Rhode Island. Summer. The year she was 17. Her mother sitting beside her with the plain white cup, watching the water with that particular quality of attention that had always made Clara feel, as a child, that Margaret was the most present person in any room she occupied. Clara had asked her question, "Why is your name on nothing you built?" And Margaret had listened to the whole of it before she answered. That was Margaret's way. She never hurried toward the point. She waited until the point had fully arrived. The name on the door is never the whole story, Clara. Read the lease. Clara had been hearing that line her whole adult life. She had heard it as a business philosophy, as her mother's eccentricity, as a piece of wisdom she kept in storage for some future use that never quite arrived. She heard it now, sitting on the edge of a bed in the Berkshires at midnight, still in her nightgown, her mother's diamond drops in her palms, and for the first time in 21 years, she heard it as something else entirely. She heard it as instruction. She heard it as a door her mother had built and left unlocked, waiting for exactly this night. She opened the drawer. The envelope was where it had always been. She broke the seal. Properly this time, all the way she should have broken it 2 years ago at the kitchen table in Providence after the funeral. And she spread the documents across the bedspread, and she read them the way she had once read contracts, from the first word of the first page, without skipping toward conclusions. The Whitfield Family Blind Trust. 43 pages. Clara Whitfield, sole trustee and controlling beneficiary. She read the asset schedule. She read the property listings. She moved through them with the methodical patience of someone who has been trained to find what a document is actually saying beneath the language designed to obscure it, and when she reached page 19, she stopped. 200 Federal Street, Boston, a Class A commercial building in the financial district. Trust ownership interest, 22%. Primary tenant, floors 14 and 15. Annual lease value, $2.1 million at $34 per square foot. Tenant name, Harmon Capital Partners, LP. She read it again. Then she sat very still for a long time. Her mother had known. Not about James specifically. Margaret had been 2 years in the ground before Clara accepted his proposal. But about the kind of man James represented, the kind of arrangement that required a woman to make herself smaller, and the kind of protection a daughter would need if she ever found herself inside one. Margaret had built the trust with 30 years of invisible work, and she had placed inside it, among other things, a 22% stake in the building where James Harmon went every morning to believe he was powerful. She had done it without knowing his name. She had done it because she understood the arithmetic of how certain lives worked. The name on the door is never the whole story. Clara understood now why her mother had never told her, because knowing would have changed the way she entered the relationship, and Margaret had not wanted to give her daughter a shield. She had wanted to give her a foundation, something that would be there if the time came to need it, invisible and permanent, the way real things are. She looked at the clock. It was 11:58 p.m. She picked up her phone. She found the number on Denise Farrow's card, still paper clipped to the front of the envelope, still crisp after 4 years, and she dialed. Denise answered on the second ring. This did not surprise Clara. Margaret had always said that Denise Farrow answered at any hour if the call was necessary, and had spent 35 years developing the judgment to know the difference. It's Clara Whitfield, Clara said. I know. A brief pause. Tell me what you need, Clara told her. She spoke clearly and without preamble, the way she used to speak in depositions, the way she used to speak before 4 years of adjustment had taught her to soften the edges of everything she said. She told Denise about the trust documentation, about the tenant ledger, about what she needed to have prepared and filed by morning. She told her where the venue was and what time the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Denise asked one question. Are you certain? Clara looked at the earrings in her palm. She thought about the floor of the sitting room. She thought about James's voice, unhurried and private, explaining her usefulness to another woman in a room he believed was empty. Yes, she said, I'll be there at 8. The call ended. 4 minutes, total. Clara set the phone down. She gathered the trust documents and returned them to the envelope with care. The way you handle things that matter. She laid her wedding dress out across the chair by the window. It was ivory silk and it caught the faint light from the grounds outside. And it was, she realized, still the most beautiful thing she owned. And she was still going to wear it tomorrow. She put the earrings back in. She turned off the lamp. She did not sleep. But the wakefulness was different now. Not the wakefulness of a woman enduring the dark, but of a woman who has set something in motion and is simply waiting, with complete stillness, for the morning to arrive. She sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the October grounds of Graywood Mill Estate lay in darkness, the old stone walls quiet, the trees moving slightly in the wind off the hills. She watched them without moving. She was no longer adjusting. She was no longer absorbing. She was no longer waiting for James Harmon's version of her life to become tolerable. She was Clara Whitfield. She had always been Clara Whitfield. And in 6 hours, Denise Farrow's car would come up the estate drive, and the story that Margaret had quietly built would finally, after all this time, be told. Denise Farrow arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, in a dark gray coat and low heels, carrying a structured leather briefcase that Clara recognized from 20 years ago. The same one Margaret had described Denise using at their first meeting. She came through the estate's side entrance, the one that opened onto the garden corridor, and she did not look around at the decorations or the floral arrangements or the ivory ribbon tied to every door handle. She looked at Clara. They sat in Clara's room at the small writing desk near the window. Denise opened the briefcase and laid the documents out in sequence without being asked. The trust summary first, then the tenant ledger, then the lease review notice, then the prenuptial agreement James's attorney had sent 6 weeks earlier. She set each one down with the economy of someone who has done this kind of work for a long time and understands that order is not ceremony, but structure. The lease review notice had been filed electronically with Harmon Capital Partners' registered business address in Boston at 9:02 a.m. Denise confirmed this without expression. The filing was already in transit. They could not unfile it. Clara looked at the prenuptial agreement. James's attorney, a man named Gerald Strout of Strout Brennan in Boston, had drafted it with careful language designed to route any inherited assets into a jointly managed structure upon marriage. It was a well-constructed document. Clara had read it the week it arrived and recognized immediately what it was trying to accomplish. She had not signed it. The trust predates the relationship by 11 years, Denise said. The prenuptial has no reach. Gerald Strout knows this. She paused. He's known it since Tuesday. Clara touched the edge of the lease review notice once. Then she stood up and put on her earrings. At 9:04 a.m., James's phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He was standing in the antechamber of the ceremony hall with his best man, a man named Carter Bowes who had been at Harvard with him and who now watched James check his phone with an expression that moved from curiosity to something less comfortable. James looked at the screen. His CFO, Alan Merritt, calling. He declined it. His legal counsel, a woman named Sandra Park, called at 9:09. He declined that too. By 9:15, his phone had vibrated 11 times, and the expression on James's face had become the kind of stillness that is not composure, but its close approximation. The look of a man who is waiting to understand what is happening before he allows himself to react to it. Eleanor noticed. She was seated in the front row with her pearls in her posture and her absolute conviction that what she was witnessing was a groom's nerves. She caught James's eye across the hall and gave him the small, assured nod of a woman who has managed higher stakes events than this. James did not nod back. He was still looking at his phone. In the guest hall, Renata Walsh was seated in the third row on the left side, still and composed, watching the altar the way she watched all things James Harmon was involved in, with the precise attention of someone calculating their position in a landscape that was about to change. She did not yet know it was about to change in the specific way it was. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock. At 2 minutes past, the doors at the far end of the glass-walled hall opened, and the room fell quiet. 200 guests turned. Clara Whitfield walked in, wearing the ivory silk dress. She was wearing the earrings. Her shoulders were straight and her pace was deliberate, and she held a dark document folder in both hands in the way that a person carries something they have decided to carry, without apology or explanation. Denise Farrow walked 2 steps behind her. The guests who registered the folder registered it as a curiosity. Most did not register it at all because they were watching Clara's face, which was composed and still and entirely unreadable in the way that faces are unreadable when the person wearing them has made a complete and final decision. She did not walk toward the altar. She walked to the anteroom door on the left side of the hall, the door Denise had arranged 40 minutes earlier, and she opened it and stood in the frame. James watched her from the front of the room. Something moved across his face, not confusion exactly, but the beginning of understanding, the first small fracture in the certainty that this morning was proceeding as planned. He walked toward her. He didn't know what else to do. Denise stepped through the door behind Clara. James followed. The door closed. The anteroom was a small, plainly furnished room used for venue administration. A rectangular table, 4 chairs, a window overlooking the east garden. James's attorney, Gerald Strout, was already seated at the far side of the table with a witness beside him, a young associate named Thomas Bellamy, who had been briefed but not on the full picture. A second witness, the venue's general manager, a woman named Ruth Calloway, sat near the window. Denise set the briefcase on the table and took the chair to Clara's left. Denise placed a glass of water in front of Clara. It was the only glass on the table. No one else was offered one. She opened with the trust summary. She laid it flat and turned it to face James and Gerald Strout. She said in the unhurried declarative sentences that were her only register. The Whitfield Family Blind Trust. Clara Whitfield, sole trustee and controlling beneficiary. Assets under management, $180 million across 7 commercial real estate holdings. She let them read. Page 2. Dependent leaseholders. Harmon Capital Partners, LP. 2 floors, 3-year tenancy. Current annual lease value, $2.1 million. The room was completely quiet. James looked at the page. His eyes moved across the tenant listing, his own firm's name, his own address, the lease terms he had signed 3 years ago with a landlord he had never investigated because the rent was below market and the building management was unremarkable. And he had never thought to read past the entity name on the contract header. He read it again. The expression that crossed his face then was not anger. It was not calculation. It was the specific, unguarded look of a man who has just understood the full architecture of his own mistake. Not in the abstract, but in the specific detail of everything he had said, every assumption he had made, every casual assessment he had delivered from a bed 18 inches above this woman, in a room he believed was empty. He looked at Clara. Denise did not pause. She placed the lease review notice on the table. 60-day renewal window, effective today. Single signatory required for approval. She tapped the signature line at the bottom of page 2. Ms. Whitfield. She then set the prenuptial agreement beside the trust summary without comment and let Gerald Strout look at the documents side by side and understand, on his own, the irrelevance of the one against the weight of the other. James said her name. He said it in the voice he used when he was repositioning, not the voice of someone who had been wrong, but the voice of someone preparing to explain why the situation was more complicated than it appeared. He said there were things to discuss. He said they could find a way to approach this that worked for everyone. He said Clara. He said her name again. She waited until he had finished. Then she said, "You should have read the lease." 7 words, spoken without heat, without performance, in the same calm and precise voice she had used 100 times in depositions and contract reviews in every professional moment of her life before she had set that life aside and called it love. The room held the words for a moment. James had nothing to put after them. Denise gathered the documents back into the briefcase with the same methodical sequence she had used to lay them out. Gerald Strout said something quiet to Thomas Bellamy that the room could not hear. Ruth Calloway looked at her hands. James sat with the lease summary still in front of him and did not move. Clara stood. She picked up the glass of water and took one small, unhurried sip and set it down. She and Denise walked to the door. In the guest hall on the other side, 200 people heard the anteroom door open. Every head turned. Clara Whitfield crossed the ceremony hall in the October light that came through the glass walls, her dress moving at her full hips and her soft shoulders, the earrings catching the light at her jaw. She did not look at Renata Walsh. She did not look at Eleanor Harmon, who had risen from her seat and whose hand had gone to her pearls. She did not look at anyone. She walked to the main doors and pushed them open and stepped out into the morning. The October air met her on the other side, cold, clean, carrying the smell of the hillside and the last of the season's leaves. She was no longer holding the document folder. She had left it on the anteroom table. She didn't need it anymore. Behind her, inside the hall, the silence held for a long moment. Then she heard James come out of the anteroom. She did not turn around to see his face. She had already seen it. She walked the estate grounds for an hour. The October morning was cold and bright, and the Berkshire Hills sat motionless against the sky. And she walked the gravel paths between the old stone walls, with her arms at her sides and her earrings still in, and she did not think about anything in particular. She simply moved through the world as herself. It had been a long time since that was enough. It was enough now. Then the consequences arrived, not dramatically, the way real things arrive, in sequence, through ordinary channels, one after another. The lease non-renewal notice was formally transmitted to Harmon Capital Partners' registered address on October 14th, 48 hours after the wedding that did not happen. 2 days after that, the story of the Whitfield Family Blind Trust and its relationship to James Harmon's headquarters building became known in the financial circles that make up Boston's private equity world, which are smaller and less discreet than the people inside them believe. By the end of October, 2 of Harmon Capital's anchor investors, Meridian Capital Group and a private family office named Caldwell Associates, had requested meetings that James's team described internally as exploratory and everyone else understood to be exits. The firm's second fund, still in its raise period, fell $40 million short of its target. The building at 200 Federal Street did not disappear. The firm relocated to a smaller floor on Summer Street in November under a short-term sublease at a cost that the operations team absorbed quietly and that Alan Merritt, the CFO, described in an internal memo as significant. Eleanor Harmon sent a letter to the Marlborough Street townhouse in the 3rd week of October. It was 2 pages, handwritten, and it arrived in an envelope with no return address, which was the only undignified thing Eleanor had ever done in Clara's presence. Clara did not open it. She set it on the kitchen counter for 1 day and then placed it, still sealed, in the recycling bin on her way out the door. She did not think about what it contained. Eleanor had spent 4 years delivering verdicts. She was not owed a hearing. Renata Walsh did not contact Clara. She did not contact James either after the first week. She had never been attached to the man. She had been attached to the position, and the position had revised itself into something she could not use. And so she moved on the way people move on when their interests rather than their hearts have been involved. Cleanly, without ceremony, and without looking back. James called Clara on October 22nd at 7:14 in the evening. She watched his name on her phone screen until it stopped. He left a voicemail. In it, he said her name, and he said he needed her to understand that he was sorry, and he said some other things that Clara listened to once and then deleted. She did not call back. There was nothing in that message that required a response, because there was nothing in it that was addressed to the actual Clara, only to the version of her he had needed her to be, and that version no longer existed and had perhaps never fully existed outside his own accounting. The scene softens now into something quieter. Denise filed the trust's formal activation documents with the Massachusetts and Rhode Island probate offices in early November. Clara's name appeared on the filings as it had always appeared on every document Margaret had ever prepared. Clara Whitfield, in full, without modification. She had never legally changed her name. She had let people call her Clara Harmon at firm dinners because it was easier than explaining. On every contract, every filing, every asset record in the Whitfield Trust, she had always been exactly who she was. She accepted a part-time advisory role at Whitmore and Crane in Providence. A conversation initiated by Patricia Hess, who called Clara in late October and did not mention their previous exchange about readiness, and whom Clara liked very much for that restraint. In November, she drove to the house on Narragansett Avenue and collected the last of her things. The house was being held in trust as well. She stood in Margaret's kitchen for a long time. She found Margaret's favorite coffee cup on the second shelf of the cabinet where it had always been. Plain white, the small chip on the handle still there, still unreplaced. She wrapped it in a dish towel and put it in her bag and took it home. The final image of this story takes place on a Saturday in late November, on the dock behind the Narragansett Avenue house. The inlet was gray and still, and the air carried the first real cold of the season, and Clara sat at the end of the dock in her coat with Margaret's cup in her hands, and the earrings in her ear, and the water moving in slow, unhurried shifts beneath her feet. She said it aloud, not to Margaret, who was gone, and not to James, who had never understood it. She said it the way you say something that has finally become yours, not as a lesson learned from someone else, but as a truth that has passed through enough of your own life to belong to you completely. The name on the door is never the whole story. Read the lease. This is a story about what women are allowed to be invisible and what it costs the people who mistake invisibility for absence. It is a story about the difference between the name on the door and the name on the document that actually controls everything. And it is a story about what happens when someone who has spent years adjusting, accommodating, and diminishing herself finally stops. Not out of anger, but out of the quiet recognition that the truth was always there, waiting to be used, and that the moment to use it had arrived. Clara Whitfield was never without power. She was simply waiting for the right room to walk into. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been the person in the room that no one thought to read the fine print about, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what part landed hardest for you, and tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. She set the cup down on the dock beside her. The wood was weathered and cold and solid beneath her hands. She looked at the water. It moved in the way water moves when it is not going anywhere in particular. Slowly, without urgency, with the absolute patience of something that has all the time it needs. Clara sat with it for a long time. She was not waiting for anything. She was not adjusting. She was simply there, in her own name, on her own dock, in the quiet that comes after the truth has finally been told.